I've played my fair share of Metroidvania games from Axiom Verge and Guacamelee to Castlevania and the Metroid games themselves. There are two games said to be responsible for the genre, and I figure it's time to share my thoughts on the one that wasn't made by Nintendo. This brings us to 1997, where Real Underdog was released for the PS1. That's right, it's time to invade Dracula's castle for the over 9,000th time and dramatically throw down the gauntlets as I review Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the PS1. Bleh! Believe it or not, two completely different types of Castlevania games were being made around this time. A 3D one on the N64 that Konami was hedging as their next big thing, and an ultra-refined 2D one on the PS1. Symphony of the Night, of course, is the latter, and I bet it really shocked Konami when it's the one that actually endured. Talk about betting on the wrong horse. The gameplay is relatively similar to a regular Castlevania game where you wander around a big castle with weapons and sub-weapons in hand. However, there are a few very important ways that Symphony of the Night differs from most previous titles. For starters, it's not just one linear line straight to the finish. It takes a page out of Super Metroid's playbook, the other game credited with sparking the Metroidvania genre, and has you exploring the many rooms throughout. Another important one for me is being able to reverse your direction in mid-air. It feels so much better when you have air control and aren't locked into one direction. Much like Super Metroid, there are also save rooms, you need certain abilities to progress, and you've got a similar looking map system. However, it also has some distinctly RPG elements that separate it from both Metroid games and the Castlevania games before it. Another neat addition, of course, is fast travel points. You can even purchase supplies and gear from the librarian. It justifies the hero having to buy things because he works for Dracula and is only willing to take the transaction due to Alucard being his son. Beating the game actually unlocks a mode where you can play through as Richter. Naturally, one of the changes is you can't buy anything from the librarian due to the Belmont bloodline. Speaking of Richter, you play as him in the beginning of the game. It's basically a retelling of Rondo of Blood's ending where he faces Dracula. Don't worry, you're not thrown into the deep end right off the bat. You're granted convenient immortality if your health falls too low. Much like with Super Metroid, it's mostly for bragging rights if you can manage to not get your health low enough to need it. Interestingly, it even has a mechanic that may have inspired Metroid Prime. What I mean is you start out with overpowered equipment befitting the son of Dracula, all your foes perishing immediately. Then death confiscates all your gear and crap gets real. You're reduced to a dagger and have to work your way back up through the totem pole. Weapon types include daggers, swords, clubs, two-handed swords, knuckles, and shields. You can get one sub-weapon at a time and they all cost hearts to use. You can get a dagger, a cross, a throwing axe, a stopwatch, and holy water. Not gonna lie, I was relying on the stopwatch near the beginning of my playthrough, thinking that stopping enemies in their tracks would be the best go. I've come to accept the OP magic that is the holy water. It's even worth losing out on the Dio reference. You gain the ability to change into a wolf at Bat and Mist. The Mist is especially handy in battle since you avoid damage from enemy attacks. You can even upgrade it to Poison Mist so that you not only avoid taking damage but you inflict damage yourself. You can also gain other abilities such as a double jump and a holy symbol. The holy symbol actually resembles a snorkel because it stops Alucard from taking damage underwater. I would say it's because vampires are damaged by moving water, but it's a snorkel so maybe he just can't hold his breath. Well, it's either that or it's a holy divine snorkel from Diver Heaven. As has become customary for Castlevania games, there's also a bad ending and a good ending. Of course, you'll need some secret items to go that route. You'll need a silver and gold ring to be able to get some holy glasses to be able to see through the curse. The last section of the game pass that sorta shows a limited budget, but it's still kinda neat in a stone temple from Majora's Mask kinda way. You get to go through the same castle, but flip turned upside down, and that's how I became the Fresh Prince of Transylvania. Joking aside, the upside down castle isn't too lengthy, but it has some pretty tough enemies. One last fight with Dracula himself and it's all over. Apparently you can get a better ending by exploring more of the map, but that mostly affects some dialogue. All in all, despite being given next to no budget and being the afterthought, it truly is something special. The gameplay feels very refined and honed. It would serve as a blueprint for side-scroller Castlevania games and for very good reason.
But I demand you cease your attack.
I will not.
You shall regret those words. We will meet again.
The story takes place as Rondo of Blood is wrapping up, where Richter must face off with Dracula while being asked,
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets!
After Dracula is defeated, Richter suddenly goes missing. This brings us to a time skip where you're suddenly playing as Dracula's half-son, Alucard, and he's storming the castle. To say he has issues with his father would be an understatement. Death confronts him and, failing to change Alucard's mind, pouts and takes off with his stuff. Fighting his way through the castle, he runs into Maria, who shares the same goal of tearing down the castle. The funny thing is she says he seems human, which made me think he was hiding his true self from her. In either case, she decides to trust him and they go their separate ways for now. After some more fighting, he runs into Maria later. She remarks that the castle layout changed and the castle is apparently a creature in itself, according to Alucard. In a later meeting, Maria asks about Richter. It seems he actually disappeared around a year ago, which makes sense since Dracula seems to reappear annually. Alucard might end up facing a possessed Richter and kill him, which I never ended up doing, but you'd get a bad ending where it's left up to mystery whatever happened to him. Choosing to get the good ending, however, Alucard will have to take some extra steps. He makes his way to the Colosseum where he's supposed to see Richter for the first time since he remarks on it. Richter declared himself lord of the castle and leaves him to fight a Minotaurus and werewolf. After defeating them, he acquires the form of Mist. Back in the library, Alucard grabs form of Bat to get the Spikebreaker armor in the catacombs. With the Bat form in hand, Alucard can get the golden ring by facing the Succubus. The Succubus poses as his mother at the stake, except the Succubus tries to manipulate him into believing his mother actually hated humanity. Naturally, Alucard sees right through it, knowing his mother would never say such a thing. After defeating the Succubus, Alucard buys the Jewel of Opening to enter the royal chapel. With the Spikebreaker armor in Bat form, he's able to get the silver ring. Wearing both in the clock tower allows him to go beneath it where Maria is waiting. She gives him holy glasses for Alucard to face Richter with. Using these holy specs, Alucard is able to see an ominous-looking orb that's controlling Richter. It's revealed to be Shaft, who is undeterred by the setback as Dracula's resurrection is soon underway. Instructing Maria to take Richter and leave, Alucard must enter the inverted castle alone. Alucard needs to collect parts of Vlad, finally confronting and beating Death in the caves while he's at it. After getting the parts, he finally kills Shaft and confronts Dracula. After beating Dracula, Alucard imparts her last words to him and he asks for forgiveness right before dying. Alucard decides he's the last of Dracula's blood, so he must disappear, leaving. Presumably exploring all the map causes Maria to chase after him, but it's a relatively small dialogue change. Either way, the story is finally over. I won't lie, it's not the most complex or original story, but it is a very interesting one. The anguish of a son having to face his malevolent father, Richter being possessed by a corrupting force, the whole story with Maria was very compelling. I like that you relive the final boss of Rondo of Blood, it shows how it ties together. As a Castlevania story, it certainly more than suffices and started the trend of having a secret better ending, one that Bloodstain would even carry over. In more ways than one, it's left quite a legacy and you certainly can't argue with that. At its core, Symphony of the Night is a retro 2D style Castlevania game. As such, it's using an aesthetic like the 16-bit Castlevania games on SNES and Genesis. However, it's not purely a 2D game. It has some 3D elements like occasionally skyboxes, some rooms being 3D, and things like 3D book enemies. Naturally, being on the PS1, it's able to take advantage of things like rotation, scaling, and transparency. Even the 2D aspects of the environments can have a good amount of detail in them, and despite taking place in a castle, there's a surprising amount of variety in the environments. The underground cavern is especially nice with the rocky structures in the background and bodies of water everywhere. Some of the enemy designs are also fairly interesting, notably the Granfalone, aka Legion. Now there are some signs of Symphony of the Night being an afterthought project on Konami's mind. You can see in FMVs that the castle isn't textured, and of course the latter chunk of the game being the same castle upside down. Still, despite this, it manages to look very pleasing throughout. The music is pretty much excellent to listen to across the board. Michiru Yama'an is very well known for her music, with good reason, and she even handled the sound effects in this game. The voice acting is typical for PS1 era, which is to say a little bit cheesy. Okay, so maybe that's mostly the what is a man scene. Maybe it was done deliberately to be a cheesy good versus evil thing before it switched to anti-hero. The funny thing is that Castlevania DXC for the PSP has a more accurate translation.
Ha! Mankind. A cesspit of hatred and lies.
Personally, I'd go with the PS1 original just because it's much more memorable and funny. In short, the presentation is quite exceptional given what they had to work with. You can tell the DS games were given more of a budget due to the concept proving itself, but Symphony of the Night is still quite nice to look at, and Yama'an's music is always a delight to listen to. Castlevania Symphony of the Night stands alongside Super Metroid as being credited with sort of sparking what we now know as the Metroidvania genre. While I wouldn't put it on the same level in that regard as Super Metroid due to it coming later, it still had its own things to add to the table. It changed Castlevania very much for the better, and if nothing else inspired a good Game Boy Advance game and 3 good DS games. Being the low-budgeted afterthought, it had a lot to overcome, and while it's described as easier and less polished compared to the DS games that came after it, it's still an exceptional game and an important part of gaming history. I'd highly recommend giving it a try if you like the style of the Game Boy Advance and DS Castlevania games since then, or Metroidvania in general. This has been my review of Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the PS1. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, a man is a miserable little pile of secrets!